James was a man who took great pride in his achievements. He had worked tirelessly for years, climbing the corporate ladder, making smart business decisions, and earning the respect of his colleagues. His promotion to senior manager was a big milestone, and he wanted to celebrate it in a grand way. His wife, Emily, had always been a supportive partner. She had been with him through his struggles, standing by his side through thick and thin. When James told her about the dinner party, she immediately took charge of the preparations. She wanted everything to be perfect for him because she knew how much this evening meant to him. Days before the event, Emily made a list of everything she needed to do. She planned the menu carefully, considering the guests' tastes. She cleaned the house thoroughly, making sure everything looked elegant and welcoming. She even spent hours watching online tutorials on how to set the table properly, wanting to impress James's colleagues with her attention to detail. The evening finally arrived. The dining table was set beautifully with fine china, polished silverware, and fresh flowers as the centerpiece. Soft music played in the background, creating a warm and sophisticated atmosphere. The food was ready, filling the house with delicious aromas. Emily had worked tirelessly the entire day, ensuring that everything was in place. One by one, the guests arrived, dressed in their best attire. James welcomed them with a proud smile, shaking hands and exchanging greetings. Everyone admired the elegant setup, complimenting Emily's efforts. She smiled politely, feeling a sense of relief that things were going well. As the guests settled into their seats, James moved to his chair at the head of the table. He looked around, nodding in satisfaction. The evening was unfolding just as he had imagined. His colleagues were engaged in conversations, laughing and enjoying themselves. It was a perfect celebration of his success. However, as James reached for his napkin, his eyes fell on the way the cutlery was arranged. His expression changed slightly. Something about the placement of the forks and knives didn't look right to him. It wasn't arranged the way he had expected. Emily noticed his change in expression and felt a slight nervousness creep up inside her. She had tried her best, but had she made a mistake? She had double-checked everything before the guests arrived. James's colleagues continued talking, unaware of his growing irritation. But Emily could sense it. She had been married to him long enough to recognize the small signs. His fingers tapping lightly against the table, his forced smile, the way his eyes stayed focused on the setting instead of the people. She knew he was displeased. She tried to silently signal them that it wasn't a big deal, that the evening was going well, and that they should enjoy the moment. But James wasn't paying attention to her silent pleas. His mind was focused on the fact that something wasn't the way he wanted it. He cleared his throat and straightened in his chair. Emily held her breath, hoping he would let it go. After all, would anyone even notice such a small detail? But James was a perfectionist, and in his mind, perfection had no room for mistakes. What happened next would leave the entire room in stunned silence. The guests continued chatting, laughing, and enjoying the evening. The aroma of freshly prepared food filled the room, and the soft music in the background added a touch of elegance. Emily glanced around, feeling a sense of relief. Everything seemed to be going well. James, however, was still focused on the way the table was arranged. He kept staring at the cutlery, his mood darkening with each passing second. To everyone else, it was just a small detail, something barely noticeable. But to James, it was a sign of carelessness, a flaw in what should have been a perfect evening. Emily noticed his clenched jaw and the way his fingers tapped impatiently against the tablecloth. She knew this side of him. He liked things to be a certain way, and when they weren't, it bothered him more than it should. She wished he would simply ignore it and enjoy the evening, but she could see that wasn't going to happen. As the guests settled in, one of James's colleagues, Mr. Bennett, raised his glass. A toast to James, a hard-working man, a true leader, and a great friend. Congratulations on your well-deserved promotion. Everyone lifted their glasses, smiling. Emily smiled too, trying to push away her worries. She wanted James to be happy tonight, But just as she reached for her glass, James suddenly turned toward her. "Emily," he said, his voice firm. "What is this?" The room fell silent. Emily blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked gently, hoping to keep the situation calm. James pointed at the table setting. "Look at the way you've arranged the cutlery," he said, his voice filled with disappointment. "It's completely wrong. How could you make such a mistake?" The guests exchanged awkward glances. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked down, pretending not to hear. The joyful atmosphere from moments ago was slowly disappearing. Emily felt her face grow warm. She had spent hours making sure everything was perfect. Could she have made a mistake? Maybe. But did it really matter? She wanted to explain, to tell him that she had done her best. But before she could say anything, James shook his head in frustration. "I expected better from you," he muttered under his breath. Emily's heart sank. She had worked so hard for this evening, wanting to make it special for him. But instead of appreciation, all she received was criticism. James sighed loudly, as if her mistake had ruined everything. Then, in front of everyone, he pushed back his chair and looked at her with disappointment. The silence in the room became heavier. The guests were unsure of what to do. Some stared at their plates, while others glanced at Emily with sympathy. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her hands trembled slightly, but she refused to let anyone see her break. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was hurt. She looked at James, her expression calm but firm. And then, without raising her voice, she said something that no one in the room expected. What she said next would change everything. A heavy silence filled the room. The laughter and cheerful conversations from earlier had completely disappeared. The guests sat frozen in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some looked down at their plates, pretending they hadn't noticed what had just happened, while others glanced at Emily with sympathy. Emily stood there, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. Her face was warm, but not from embarrassment. No, it was something else. A strange calmness had taken over her. She looked at James, the man she had supported for years, the man she had sacrificed so much for, and realized something. This wasn't the first time he had spoken to her like this. Maybe not in front of others, but in private, he had often made her feel small. He had a way of making her believe that everything had to be perfect, that mistakes were unacceptable. And for years, she had tried. She had tried to be the perfect wife, to meet his expectations, to never disappoint him. But tonight, something inside her shifted. Emily took a deep breath, straightened her back, and looked at James, not with fear, not with anger, but with an unwavering calmness that surprised even her. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this," she said softly, her voice steady and clear. "But thank you for coming. This will be the last dinner I ever host in this house." A sharp gasp came from one of the guests. A few people exchanged shocked glances, while others sat up straighter, suddenly paying full attention. James frowned, his expression turning to confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice lower now, as if realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. Emily didn't look away. "I mean exactly what I said," she replied. "This is the last time I will put my heart and soul into something, only to be humiliated for it." A deep silence filled the room once again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just awkward, it was powerful. Emily wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't crying. She wasn't making a scene. And yet, her words carried more weight than anything James had said all evening. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He could see the expressions on his guests' faces. Some of them were nodding slightly, as if silently agreeing with Emily. Others looked at him with quiet judgment. The respect and admiration he had expected to receive that night were slowly crumbling before his eyes. Mr. Bennett, one of James's senior colleagues, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Emily, I must say, you handled that with grace," he said with a small nod. And I believe I speak for everyone when I say that no one deserves to be treated that way, especially not after putting in so much effort. A few of the guests murmured in agreement. James's face turned pale. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. He had wanted to impress his colleagues, to show them that he had the perfect life, the perfect home, the perfect wife. But now, they were looking at him differently. Emily turned to the guests, offering them a polite smile. "Please, enjoy your meal," she said, "but I won't be staying." With that, she turned and walked away, her head held high. The room remained silent for a long time after she left, and for the first time in his life, James realized he might have just lost the best thing he ever had. "You said," as Emily walked away, the weight of the moment pressed on everyone in the room. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The air, once filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, now felt thick and heavy. James sat frozen in his chair. He had expected his guests to move on from the situation, to resume their conversations, to act as if nothing had happened. But that didn't happen. Instead, they looked at him, some with quiet disappointment, others with clear disapproval. Mr. Bennet, who had always been supportive of James's career, finally broke the silence. He placed his glass down with a soft clink and leaned forward slightly. His voice was calm, but there was something firm beneath it. "James," he said, "I've known you for years. I've seen your ambition, your determination. But I never imagined I'd see this side of you." James shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a misunderstanding," he said quickly, forcing a small laugh. "You know how these things go." But no one laughed with him. One of the other guests, a younger colleague named Mark, shook his head. "I don't think that was a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "That was something else." A few others nodded in agreement. James's face grew warm. He felt trapped, as if the walls of his own house were closing in on him. He had spent years building his reputation, making sure people saw him as a strong, respectable man. But in one night, in one moment, everything had changed. He cleared his throat. "Let's not make a big deal out of this," he said, forcing a smile. "We're here to celebrate, aren't we?" He lifted his glass, hoping to bring the conversation back to where it was before. But no one followed his lead. Instead, one by one, the guests began shifting in their seats. Some reached for their coats. Others exchanged quick glances as if silently deciding what to do next. Then Mr. Bennet stood up. "I think I'll be heading home," he said, his voice polite but distant. "It's been an interesting evening." James's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Mr. Bennet was an important figure in his company. If he left on bad terms, others would follow. And they did. Within moments, chairs scraped against the floor as guests gathered their belongings. The quiet murmurs of conversation filled the space, but none of them were directed at James. No one offered him a handshake. No one said goodbye warmly. They simply nodded at him, gave Emily one last glance, though she was no longer in the room, and left. James remained seated, his hands clenched into fists. He had spent so much time planning this evening, making sure everything was perfect. But now his guests were gone, his celebration ruined, and the house that once felt like his kingdom now felt strangely empty. He looked at the table in front of him. The food, once steaming hot and inviting, was now untouched and growing cold. The plates were still perfectly arranged, but now it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't just frustration. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was regret. The house, which had been filled with chatter and laughter just an hour ago, now stood eerily silent. The dining table was still set, the candles flickering softly, but the seats were empty. Plates of untouched food sat there, now cold. Glasses, once raised in celebration, remained half full, abandoned by the guests who had quietly walked out. James sat alone, staring at the table. He had imagined this evening differently. He had wanted his colleagues to admire him, to see how successful he was, not just at work but in life. He had wanted them to see his perfect home, his perfect dinner, and his perfect wife. But now, instead of admiration, he had earned their silent judgment. Instead of looking up to him, they had walked away, disappointed. His mind replayed the events of the evening. He could still hear the sound of Emily's voice, calm yet powerful, as she told everyone this would be the last dinner she hosted in this house. He could still see the way she had held her head high as she walked away, leaving him behind. James ran a hand over his face, sighing deeply. He knew Emily was upset, but she had always forgiven him in the past. Maybe she just needed time to calm down. He decided to check on her. He stood up and walked toward their bedroom. As he climbed the stairs, he realized how quiet the house felt without her presence. He suddenly felt a strange emptiness, something he had never felt before. When he reached the bedroom, he pushed the door open slowly. His heart sank at the sight before him. Emily was standing by the wardrobe, packing a suitcase. His breath caught in his throat. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than before. "What are you doing?" She didn't look at him right away. She carefully folded a dress and placed it in the suitcase before finally turning to face him. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in them that he had never seen before. "I'm leaving, James," she said simply. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. He let out a small, nervous laugh. "Come on, Emily. Don't be dramatic. We had a little disagreement, that's all. You just need some time to cool down." Emily shook her head. "No, James. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was the final straw." His chest tightened. "The final straw," he repeated. She sighed, looking down at the suitcase before meeting his eyes again. "I've spent years trying to make you happy. I've tried to be the wife you wanted me to be. I've tried to meet every expectation you've set, but no matter how hard I try, it's never enough for you." James opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew she was right. Emily continued, her voice steady but firm. "Tonight, I realized something. I've spent so much time trying to be perfect for you that I forgot to be kind to myself, and I can't do it anymore." James took a step forward, his hands slightly raised. "Emily, please, let's talk about this." She gave him a small, sad smile. "We've talked before, James, but nothing changes." She zipped up her suitcase, lifted it from the bed, and turned toward the door. James's heart pounded. He had always believed that Emily would never leave, that no matter what happened, she would stay. But now, as she walked past him, he realized something that scared him more than anything. James stood frozen as Emily walked past him, her suitcase rolling quietly across the wooden floor. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She had been upset with him before, but she had never actually packed her bags. A strange fear gripped his chest. He had always assumed she would stay, no matter what. He had believed that no matter how many times he criticized her, she would forgive him. After all, she had always been there, supporting him, making sure everything was perfect for him. But now she was leaving. He turned quickly and followed her down the stairs. "Emily, wait," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Let's talk about this. You don't have to leave." She didn't stop. She continued walking toward the front door, her steps calm but firm. James could feel his heart pounding harder. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation. When she reached the door, she paused for a moment. A deep breath escaped her lips, and she placed her hand on the doorknob. James took another step toward her. "Emily," he said softly, his voice almost pleading. "Don't go." She turned to face him, and for the first time that night, he saw something in her eyes that sent a cold wave through him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't even sadness. It was certainty. "I have to go, James," she said. "For myself." He swallowed hard. "But why now?" His voice was quieter now, no longer filled with authority, no longer trying to control the moment. "Why not give me another chance?" Emily studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Because I've given you enough chances, and every time I convinced myself things would get better. But they didn't." She shook her head. "And tonight, I finally realized I don't have to live like this." Her words stung more than he expected. He had always seen himself as a strong, successful man, someone in control. But right now, standing in front of Emily, he felt small. She turned back to the door and opened it. A cold breeze rushed in, making the curtains sway gently. James felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, that would make her stay. But he didn't know what to say. "Where will you go?" he finally asked. Emily gave him a small, tired smile. "Somewhere I can find myself again." And with that, she stepped out. James stood at the doorway, watching as she walked toward the car parked outside. She placed her suitcase in the trunk, then opened the driver's door. For a moment, she hesitated. James held his breath, hoping she would change her mind, that she would turn around and say she wasn't really leaving. But she didn't. She got inside, started the engine, and drove away. James remained standing there long after the car had disappeared down the street. The house behind him, which once felt grand and important, now felt painfully empty. He had spent years chasing success, respect, and perfection. But in the process, he had lost something far more valuable. And now, for the first time, he truly understood. He had taken Emily for granted. But now, it was too late to fix it. James closed the door slowly, the soft click echoing in the silent house. He turned around and looked at the empty living room. The once warm and inviting space now felt lifeless. The dining table was still set, the candles flickering, but there was no one left to enjoy the meal. He sat down on the couch, his mind spinning. He had never imagined this day would come. Emily had always been there, waiting for him, supporting him, making sure everything in his life was perfect. But now, she was gone. A strange emptiness settled in his chest. He had spent years believing that his success and reputation were the most important things in life. He had worked hard, built a career, and made sure everything in his home looked perfect to outsiders. But in doing so, he had ignored the one person who had truly cared for him. His eyes moved across the room, landing on small reminders of Emily. The cozy blanket she always used when watching TV, the scented candles she loved, the family photo on the shelf where she stood beside him, smiling, back when they were happy. James let out a long breath and leaned back, rubbing his temples. He could still hear her voice in his mind, calm and steady, telling him she was leaving for herself. For herself. He had never considered her feelings before. He had never asked her if she was happy. He had assumed that as long as she was in the house, everything was fine. But now, thinking back, he could see all the signs he had ignored. The quiet sighs, the tired look in her eyes, the way she hesitated before answering his questions. How long had she been unhappy? The thought unsettled him. He had always believed he was doing everything right, providing a good home, maintaining order, making sure things were perfect. But now, he realized that none of that mattered if she felt unappreciated. James got up and walked to the dining table. He stared at the carefully arranged plates, the untouched food, the flowers Emily had placed in the center to make the table look beautiful. She had done all of this for him, for their guests, for the life they had built together. And he had ruined it. He pulled out the chair where Emily had sat earlier that night and sank into it. He rested his elbows on the table, his fingers intertwined, his gaze fixed on the candle's flame. For the first time in his life, he felt regret. True, deep regret. Not just because Emily had left, but because he had never truly seen her before. He had been so focused on making things look good that he had ignored the person who had been by his side all these years. Would she ever come back? James didn't know. But as he sat there in the quiet house, He finally understood one thing. He had taken Emily for granted, and now he was paying the price. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he could fix it. Days passed, but the emptiness in the house remained the same. James woke up every morning expecting to hear Emily's footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of her humming as she made coffee. But there was only silence. He went to work as usual, but nothing felt the same. His colleagues, the ones who had attended the dinner that night, treated him differently. The respect he had once commanded seemed to have faded. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt forced. It was as if they all knew something had changed. But the biggest change wasn't how others saw him. It was how he saw himself. For the first time, he truly thought about Emily, not just as his wife, but as a person. He thought about her kindness, her patience, and all the little things she had done for him over the years that he had never appreciated. Like the way she always remembered his favorite meals, or how she made sure his shirts were ironed perfectly before an important meeting, or how she had always stood beside him, smiling, even when he had taken her for granted. And now, she was gone. One evening, after another long and tiring day, James found himself standing in front of the wardrobe. Emily's side was empty. The clothes she had once neatly arranged were gone. Only a few forgotten scarves and a faint scent of her perfume remained. He ran a hand over the empty space. He had spent years believing that he was the one holding everything together, that his decisions were the most important. But standing there, in the quiet of their bedroom, he realized that Emily had been the heart of their home. And without her, the house was just a house. James sat down on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He had never felt this way before. He had faced many challenges in life. At work, in business, in leadership. But this was different. This was loss. Real loss. And it hurt more than he had ever imagined. That night, unable to sleep, he picked up his phone and stared at Emily's number. He wanted to call her, to tell her he was sorry, to ask her to come back. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Apologies were easy. Change was hard. He had to show her that he truly understood. So, the next morning, he did something he had never done before. He sat at the dining table alone and thought about all the ways he had failed her. He made a list, not of the things she had done wrong, but of the things he had done wrong. He remembered the times he had dismissed her feelings, the moments he had chosen his pride over kindness. He thought about how he had made her feel unimportant when she had been the most important part of his life. And then, for the first time in years, James decided to change. Not for his reputation, not for the guests who had judged him, not even to convince Emily to come back, but because he finally saw the truth. He had been wrong. Emily deserved better, and whether she chose to return or not, he was going to become a better man, not just for her, but for himself.